Hold it, and the first thing you notice is that there's nowhere to put your fingers. There's no trigger guard. There's no room for one. You pinch this pistol between a thumb and a forefinger, the way you'd hold a pocket watch you were about to wind, and you fire it with the very tip of your finger, because the tip of your finger is the only part of your hand that fits. Then look at what it eats. A cartridge 11 millimeters long, from the base of the primer to the tip of the bullet. An American penny is a little over 19 millimeters across. You could lay this round flat on that coin twice and still see copper. And here's the detail that stops people. This is not a model, not a jeweler's novelty, not a watch fob toy. It has a serial number. It carries proof marks. The stamps a state-proof house applies only after it has test-fired a weapon and decided the weapon is a weapon. It has a patent, Austrian patent number 45314, filed in 1910. It was sold in shops, in a lined case, to customers who intended to carry it on their body. It fires a bullet weighing 0.2 of a gram, and it produces 4 joules of muzzle energy, less than an average person's punch. So the question was never how somebody built this. Watchmakers had been building impossible small things for 300 years. The question is, what kind of order ends in this object? Because behind every strange decision here, the missing guard, the absurd caliber, the choice to make it self-loading at all, there is a brief, a list of things somebody wanted. And that list is the only thing that makes this pistol make sense. The list begins, the way these lists usually do, with a crowded market. By the turn of the century, Europe had been buying pocket guns for 2 generations, and the category had gone strange. There were Velodog revolvers. There were palm pistols like the French-made Protector. There were dozens of concealable personal protection designs sold across the continent, and the Velodog is the one that tells you the most. It was built for cyclists, and it was built for dogs. For the animal that comes off a farmyard at your wheel on an empty road. Not for war, not for murder. For the ordinary hazards of moving through a country at 3 in the afternoon. That's the shelf the Kolibri was designed to sit on. Not the shelf with the Mauser and the Luger. The shelf with the umbrella and the pocket watch. And that shelf was getting expensive. In 1905, John Browning designed the .25 ACP cartridge specifically to fight for this market, which meant every small workshop in Austria, Belgium, and Germany was suddenly up against a Browning design backed by Colt and Fabrique Nationale. You could not win on price. You could not win on performance. You could only win on being smaller, which is where the workshop comes in. Franz Pfannl learned his trade as a watch and clock maker in his father's shop in Krems an der Donau, on the Danube west of Vienna. He sold the shop. Then he did something odd with the skills. From 1897, he began making Berloque pistols and rifles, working single-shot guns built as watch chain pendants, and the operation grew to 50 workers, big enough that it supplied parts to other manufacturers who finished them under their own markings and their own grips. That last detail reframes everything. This wasn't an eccentric alone at a bench. This was a component supplier, an industrial subcontractor whose speciality was the very small. And in the world Pfannl came from, the very small carried a specific meaning. Under the European guild system, a journeyman gunmaker had to produce an exact, fully functioning miniature of a real firearm in order to be made a master of the trade. And because the work was so exacting, few of them ever made the jump. A miniature isn't a joke in that culture. A miniature is an examination. It's the thing you build to prove you're allowed to call yourself what you call yourself. So when the money arrived, it arrived for a man who had spent 13 years passing that exam, over and over, for other people's catalogs. In 1910, Pfannl and a friend named Georg Grabner looked at how well small self-defense handguns were selling, the Derringers, the pepper boxes, the palm pistols, and settled on an idea: a tiny defensive pistol for a woman's purse. Grabner put up the financing. And although Grabner is often credited as the creator, the design was Pfannl's. Here is the specification that everything else in this story hangs from. The gun they set out to build would have very little power, and it would be very loud. Loud enough, in theory, to frighten an attacker off. They named it after a bird, Kolibri, German for hummingbird, among the smallest birds there are. Now hold that brief up and look at it properly, because it contains a contradiction that no amount of craftsmanship dissolves. Every millimeter you take out of a firearm takes out powder, takes out barrel, takes out velocity. Shrink a pistol far enough, and you are no longer building a weapon that happens to be small. You are building a small thing shaped like a weapon. Pfannl seems to have understood that earlier than anybody else in the trade, which is why he didn't start with the pistol at all. Start with the ammunition, and the pistol stops being absurd. Every other designer in Europe was working the other way round. They took a cartridge that already existed, a .25 ACP, a 6.35, a .22, and asked how small a gun could be wrapped around it. The cartridge was the fixed point. The gun was the variable. Pfannl inverted it. He decided how small the object should be, then built a cartridge to fit inside the answer. That's a watchmaker's sequence, not a gunmaker's. In horology, you don't buy the movement and design a case for it. You are handed the case, a wrist, a waistcoat pocket, and the mechanism obeys. Here's what obeying it looked like. The case is 9.4 millimeters long, 3.6 millimeters across the base. The complete round weighs 5.3 grams, and the bullet at the front of it weighs 0.2 of a gram. 3 grains. Almost everything else in your hand is brass primer and powder. Now the decision that shows Pfannl was making a point. He made it centerfire. At this scale, that is close to perverse, because 2 easier roads were already paved. In a rimfire, the priming compound is spun into the hollow rim of the case during manufacture. There's no separate part. The firing pin crushes the edge of the case itself. Nothing has to be made small because nothing extra has to be made at all. Centerfire means the opposite. A discrete primer cup seated dead center in the head of the case, with its own anvil, its own compound, its own tolerances. Inside a case head 3.6 millimeters wide. You are building a component inside a component at a diameter narrower than the tip of a ballpoint pen, and it has to fire every single time after 6 months in a handbag. Pfannl took the hard road because the hard road was the argument. A rimfire Kolibri would have been a novelty that fired. A centerfire Kolibri was a firearm that happened to be tiny. But that choice dragged a second problem behind it, and this one is the elegant part. The case is rimless, straight-walled, and it headspaces on its own mouth. Headspace is what stops a cartridge at exactly the right depth in the chamber. Too deep, and the firing pin can't reach the primer hard enough to set it off. Too shallow, and the breech won't close. Most cartridges solve it with a rim, a lip on the base that catches on the back of the barrel like the head of a nail. Simple, forgiving, and wider. And wider means a wider magazine, a wider grip, a bigger gun. So the rim had to go, which leaves only the front edge of the case, shouldering against a step machined into the chamber, and makes that brass tube, 9.4 millimeters of it, a critical dimension. Every round has to be the same length to a tolerance you cannot see, or the gun either misfires or won't shut. That isn't ammunition tolerance, it's watch tolerance. Pfannl chose it because it was the only tolerance he knew how to hold. And then he hit the wall that precision doesn't get you over. Powder. There is essentially no volume in that case. Whatever you load, you are loading a pinch, and a conventional smokeless charge in that space does almost nothing. But the brief never asked for lethality. It asked for a bang. So the propellant appears to have been chosen for exactly that. Collectors' descriptions of surviving examples record that the Kolibri used flash powder, specifically to increase the apparent effectiveness of the shot. Flash powder is the stuff of stage effects in early photography. Fast, bright, and loud out of all proportion to the work it does. If your specification is a weapon that frightens people, that isn't a compromise. It's the correct answer. The Kolibri wasn't underpowered by accident. It was tuned for the flash. And that distinction, bad weapon versus correct answer to a strange question, is the whole reason objects like this are worth an hour of anyone's time. If it's why you're here, subscribing is how more of them find you. Which brings us to the number. The bullet leaves the muzzle at roughly 200 meters a second, producing 4 joules. An air pistol sends its pellet out between 350 and 600 feet per second. The Kolibri manages about 660. So on velocity alone, it sits in air gun territory. And velocity is the flattering half of the equation, because energy scales with mass, and the Kolibri's mass is almost nothing. A .22 long rifle throws a 40-grain bullet for roughly 105 foot-pounds. The Kolibri produces 3, and in the only test that mattered to a buyer in 1912, will this stop a man? Period literature put its penetration at 10 to 40 millimeters of pine board, between a finger's width and a wrist's width of soft wood, and that is the good end of the range. And the numbers themselves won't hold still. One standard reference lists the round at 475 feet per second and 1 3/4 foot-pounds, barely half the energy everybody else quotes. That isn't careless record-keeping. It's what happens when a fractional variation in a pinch of powder moves the result by a factor of 2. At this scale, ammunition doesn't have a specification. It has a mood. Still, Pfannl had done the impossible half. He had a working centerfire cartridge smaller than anything the world had made, or has made since. If he'd stopped there and built a single-shot pistol around it, this would be a footnote about a clever man in Krems. He decided it should be self-loading instead, which meant taking 4 joules, a force you could absorb on your palm without flinching, and asking it to eject a spent case, compress a spring, strip a fresh round out of a magazine, and chamber it. All of that from a recoil impulse smaller than a fingertip tap. That's the part everyone assumes was impossible. It wasn't impossible. It was simple. That's the joke at the center of this gun. The Kolibri uses a straightforward blowback action, a fixed barrel, and a breech block that slides back and forth behind it. Gas from the fired cartridge drives the block rearward, ejecting the empty case. A recoil spring shoves it forward again, strips the next round out of the magazine, and chambers it. Same principle as a modern .22 target pistol, a .25 pocket auto, most .32s. Nothing exotic, nothing invented. And here is why Pfannl could get away with it. Blowback works precisely because the cartridge is low pressure and low impulse. There's no need for the locked breech a larger caliber demands, which is a genuine inversion. The thing that makes the Kolibri useless as a weapon is the same thing that makes it buildable as a machine. A .45 has to be locked shut for a fraction of a second, or it tears itself apart. 4 joules can be held in check by a piece of steel the size of a sugar cube and a spring you could stretch with your eyelashes. The weakness is the enabling condition. But simple is not the same as easy, and this is where the watchmaker earns it. Blowback has a lower limit as well as an upper one. The impulse has to be enough to overcome the inertia of the block, compress the spring, drag the case clear, and still carry the block far enough back for the magazine to present the next round. Below that threshold, the gun fires once and stops. A very expensive single shot. The Kolibri has 4 joules in total, and most of it leaves down the barrel with the bullet. What's left to run the mechanism is a tap. So every mass comes down, every spring rate comes down with it. And the window where it all still works, block light enough to move, but heavy enough to stay shut. Spring soft enough to compress but stiff enough to chamber, is vanishingly narrow. Nobody in gunsmithing was solving problems at that resolution. Escapement makers were. It's the same discipline as making a watch run off the unwinding of a hairspring. Not enough force to waste, so nothing may be wasted. Now look at how he packaged it, because the layout is unusually clever for something meant to be cheap. The slide runs along internal grooves cut into the frame, held there by a single transverse screw. The barrel unit sits in a barrel jamb welded to the frame and pinned in place. The recoil spring doesn't live under the barrel. It lives inside the barrel unit, above the bore, with its guide rod connected to the slide. The frame itself is stamped, and 2 side plates tie the frame, the barrel jamb and the barrel unit together, spreading the shock of firing across the whole structure instead of concentrating it anywhere. A stamped frame in 1910 is a production decision. It means Pfannl intended volume, not a bench-made curiosity. The side plates are a strength decision. At this size, there's no meat anywhere, so the load has to be shared. And the magazine catch is well thought out and easy to work, which is the sort of thing you only bother with if you genuinely expect somebody to reload the gun in a hurry. And then the omissions. Every one of them is a decision. The barrel is smooth-bored because of how small the bore is. Rifling a caliber that Pfannl was beyond the machinery of the day. So the bullet leaves with no spin at all, which is why accuracy was, in the polite phrasing of the period, an issue. The barrel is 1 1/4 inches, roughly half the length of the Colt 1908 vest pockets. Some examples left the factory with no sights of any kind. None of that is sloppiness. Sights are pointless on a smooth bore meant for arm's length. Rifling would have added cost to a bullet that isn't traveling far enough for spin to matter, and a trigger guard on a 65mm pistol would have eaten the grip, which is precisely why the gun you're holding in 2 fingers doesn't have one. Strip the object of everything that doesn't serve the brief, and this is the residue. The markings finish the picture, and they tell you something the specification sheet doesn't. The right side of the frame is stamped P. Pfannl's automat pistol. There's a crown over end proof on the barrel and on the slide. The safety toggle is marked FEU and SUR, fire and safe in French. The grips carry an FP monogram in an oval and the word Kolibri in a banner. French on the safety of an Austrian pistol tells you who this was built for. Export examples went further still. Gilded metalwork, engraving, pearl grips, some stamped cremes /D, for the town where the factory was. This was a product aimed outward. At Paris, at Brussels, at anywhere a small expensive object could be sold as an object. And look at that frame marking once more, because it solves a small mystery. You'll see this gun called the Kolibri car pistol, and nobody can quite say why. Automat pistol. Somewhere in a chain of catalogs and translations, an automatic pistol became an auto pistol, became a car pistol, and it stuck for a century. The cartridge got the same treatment in reverse. Everybody calls it the 2mm Kolibri when the bullet actually measures 2.7. The most famous fact about this gun is that it's the smallest ever made, and the name it's famous under undersells it by 0.7 of a millimeter. One last thing, because the Kolibri was never a single object. There was a Model 1, a single shot, under 1.75 inches long. There was the Model 2, the self-loader, the one everything so far is described. And there was a rarer version chambered for a 3mm round. The whole pistol weighs 220 grams and runs 65 to 70 millimeters end to end. So by 1914, the machine was finished, patented, proofed, stamped, tooled for production, offered in variants, dressed for export. Everything that could be solved on a drawing board had been solved. What was left is the part no engineer controls. The Kolibri now had to walk into a shop and persuade a stranger to hand over money for it. And the year it walked in was 1914. The gun didn't fail on a battlefield. It failed on a counter. The usual figure is about 1,000 built between 1910 and 1914, and then production stopped. Austria's economy went onto a war footing, and it had no room left for pistols you could store in a tobacco tin. That's true, and it's also a little too kind. It hands the Kolibri an alibi. A war happened. The more interesting thing is what customers were already doing with the object before the war arrived, because they had quietly decided what it was, and it wasn't what the brief said. Look at what survives. One example with fine scroll engraving and silver-plated grip panels in a French-fitted case. One in a pasteboard clamshell case with an Art Nouveau metallic exterior, purple velvet in the base, white silk in the lid, a printed green Kolibri label, and a small tin of cartridges with a bore brush. Export guns gilded, engraved, fitted with pearl. That is not how a defensive weapon is sold. That is how a fountain pen is sold, a cigarette case, a christening spoon. The brief said, something a woman can carry in a handbag to frighten off an attacker. The market answered, something a man buys as a present, which then lives in a drawer, in its silk-lined box, being shown to visitors. The Kolibri was reclassified by its own buyers from equipment to gift, and once an object crosses that line, it stops being judged on whether it works. It gets judged on whether it's charming. Charming is a much easier test to pass. It is also a much smaller market, and a far worse one to be standing in when money gets tight. Meanwhile, the shelf it had been built for was moving in exactly the opposite direction. In Germany, August Menz was building the Lilliput around a 4.25 millimeter cartridge. Pfannl's own Erica used the same round. Menz eventually offered a 6 millimeter as well. The Lilliput is one of the smallest semi-automatics ever built. The Kolibri is generally reckoned smaller, and mechanically it's the same idea. A simple blowback with an unlocked breech, executed one size up. One size up is where the customers went. Pfannl's Erica ran from 1912 with a 6-round magazine and a barrel between 42 and 56 millimeters. Set that against the Kolibri's 1.25 inch, and you can watch the correction happening in real time inside one man's own catalog. He had a product that was the smallest in the world, and a product that was merely very small. And the merely very small one was the one with a future. Then the war came for the workshop itself, and the irony here is close to perfect. During the First World War, Pfannl's factory manufactured rifle grenades and flamethrowers. The bench that had spent 15 years learning to make things too small to hurt anybody was turned over to making things whose entire function was to hurt as many people as possible at once. Same tooling discipline, same workforce, opposite instruction. Whatever precision Pfannl had developed chasing 3-grain bullets went into ordnance for the Isonzo. After the war, he came back to pistols. And this next part reads like a confession. Production of the Kolibri restarted, but in larger cartridge sizes. 3 millimeter, 4.25. He built a 3 millimeter gun in the 1920s, and in 1925 he produced a 4 millimeter Flaubert. Every single time Pfannl returned to the problem, he made it bigger. The man who held the record for the smallest functioning centerfire pistol on Earth never once tried to defend that record. He spent the second half of his working life walking away from it, one caliber at a time, which is the clearest engineering verdict anybody ever delivered on the Kolibri, and it came from the person best qualified to deliver it. Even the retreat wasn't enough. Grabner's factory ran into hard times and closed before the end of the 1920s, with the Kolibri its most successful product. Sit with that phrase for a second. Most successful, describing a gun that sold around 1,000 units and was mocked by everyone who ever put it over a chronograph. That tells you how the rest of the catalog did. The last of it ended in 1938, when production was discontinued following the German occupation of Austria. The factory buildings went on to make pencils. During the Second World War, the site was used for secret weapons testing. Miniature pistols, then grenades, then pencils, then whatever the Reich was doing there and didn't write down. Pfannl himself lived until 1961 and died at 94. He outlived the company that made his name by more than 30 years. Which leaves the count, and the count is a mess in a way that's revealing. One authority says fewer than 1,000 were made before the war interrupted production. Another puts the total at around 3,500 across the calibers. They cannot both be describing the same thing, and the gap between them isn't anyone's arithmetic. It's a gap in the records themselves. Part of the reason is simple attrition. Many were lost or picked up as souvenirs during the Second World War, and a pistol 70 millimeters long is the single easiest object in a ransacked house to put in a pocket and never mention again. An unknown number of Kolibris left Austria in a coat lining and surfaced decades later in an estate sale in Ohio with no paperwork at all. So by 1945, the position is this: a weapon that struggled to get through a plank, a company that went under, a designer who spent 20 years disowning his own record, a production run so small and so scattered that nobody can agree on its size to within a factor of 3. By every measure that mattered in 1914, the Kolibri is finished. And then the price starts to climb. In 2022, a Kolibri Model 1, the single shot, sold at Rock Island for $2,644. The year before, a nickel-finished self-loader in its case went for $9,200. $9,000 for a pistol that couldn't reliably get through a pine board. Rarity is part of it, but rarity alone doesn't do this. Plenty of guns are rare and cheap because nobody wants them. Something else is running underneath that price, and you can see it in the ammunition. Individual original rounds now trade between $100 and $150 a piece. And because the supply is finite and shrinking, a small parallel industry has appeared. A machinist in Tennessee makes modern live 2.7 millimeter Kolibri cartridges, copper primer cup, lead projectile, primer and powder sealed so they keep for years, at $50 each. Sold explicitly as collectibles for display and not intended to be fired. Read that last clause again, because it is the strangest sentence in this entire story. Somebody is manufacturing live ammunition on the condition that nobody shoot it. That is the Kolibri's condition today. A functioning machine that has outlived its own fuel, and the fuel is now so valuable that burning it is the irrational choice. Every original cartridge fired is $100 converted permanently into noise. So the guns sit in cases lined with silk, loaded with rounds that will never be discharged, doing exactly what their buyers in 1913 decided they were for: being looked at. The object won its argument with its designer. Pfannl built a weapon. The market said ornament, and a century later it is still saying it, only louder and with more zeros. That's the sentimental half of the price. The other half is a record, and it's both more contested and more intact than almost anyone realizes. Guinness recognizes the Swiss minigun C1ST as the world's smallest working revolver. 55 millimeters, under 20 grams, built in Switzerland from 2005 using techniques out of the Swiss watch and jewelry trades, firing a 2.34 millimeter rimfire round that produces just under 1 joule. And separately, Guinness lists the smallest pistol as one built by the Argentine maker Carlos Alberto Balbiani. So the Kolibri has been beaten twice, and beaten by neither. The Balbiani gun isn't a semi-automatic, and a revolver and a self-loading pistol are fundamentally different machines. Nobody has taken the specific title. The smallest serially produced centerfire self-loading pistol ever made is still an Austrian design patented in 1910. Not because the record is defended, but because after Pfannl walked away from it, nobody else wanted it. This isn't a land speed record. It's the deepest hole ever drilled. It stands because the attempt stopped making sense. And there's a hard number underneath that. The UK House of Commons has cited a threshold of roughly 1 foot-pound of energy for a projectile to inflict a penetrating wound. Below that, it can't get through even the most vulnerable parts of the body, such as the eye. Though ballistics specialists note that at close range, a weaker projectile can still break skin. The Swiss revolver, at under a joule, sits below that line. The Kolibri, at 3 foot-pounds, sits just above it. And the more conservative figure of 1 3/4 foot-pounds brings it almost down to the line itself. That's the corridor this object lives in. Not a toy, not a weapon. The strip between them, a few foot-pounds wide, where a thing can genuinely wound and genuinely cannot stop anyone. Pfannl didn't stumble in there. He aimed for it on the theory that a loud, bright bang would do the work energy couldn't. He was the first to build a serious product in that corridor, and he is still, more or less, the last. Which brings us to the verdict everyone quotes, and to who actually delivered it. Frank Barnes, in Cartridges of the World, the standard reference on the subject, wrote that the round might do to dispatch a trapped mouse, or see off an unusually aggressive cockroach. Look at the date on that. Barnes wasn't a Viennese shopkeeper in 1914. He's a reference book author decades later, looking back at a cartridge that had already lost. The Kolibri's most famous insult was written by posterity, which means the object had to survive long enough and stay interesting enough for somebody to bother insulting it. Most failed guns get silence. And then, in 2016, it happened again, in a form nobody could have predicted. Dice put the Kolibri into Battlefield 1 alongside the Mauser C96 and the Gewehr 98 and gave it the lowest damage of any weapon in the game. In first person, the player carries it pinched between 2 fingers, swapping out minute magazines. They modeled the 2-finger grip, the exact consequence of the exact decision Pfannl made in 1910 when he deleted the trigger guard to save 4 millimeters of frame, rendered in polygons 106 years later, for an audience that had never heard of Krems under Donau. Within the community, it became a way to humiliate whoever was unlucky enough to be killed by it. Players call it a textbook pea shooter and note that its rounds barely penetrate an inch of wood, which is, to the millimeter, what the period literature said in the 1910s. A century of technological progress, and the verdict landed on the same sentence as the original ballistic tests. 4 lives then, a guild proof of mastery, a defensive weapon its own customers turned into a gift, a record nobody contests, and now a joke that teaches half a generation what a real firearm can be shrunk to. If that's the kind of history you want more of, objects whose engineering only makes sense once you find the brief, and whose real story starts after everyone agrees they failed, this channel is built out of them. Subscribe, and the next one comes to you. Because here's what Pfannl actually proved, and it isn't what he set out to prove. He answered, can it be built completely? The cartridge worked. The blowback cycled off a taper recoil. The stamped frame, the shared load paths, the case that head-spaced on its own mouth. All of it functioned in production for paying customers, and it still functions in surviving examples today. He never answered the other question. And the fact that nobody has taken his record in 116 years is not a monument to how hard the thing was to do. It's everyone else agreeing on the answer he refused to give.